All right,
Does my backwards hat make me look unprofessional?
this is being recorded.
I know.
Okay. Splice that out.
Keep it.
All right. I am the Chief Leasing Manager for Right Development. My name is Ryan.
My name is Ryan. I don't have a name.
Yeah.
I'm
I made
he
it.
without name.
I'm choosing I don't actually have a name.
No, I understand. And I am the, if I can find this. Sorry, temporary amnesia. I don't even remember who I am, but I represent Summit Stores.
I'm the Chief Leasing Manager, as mentioned, for Right Development Company. So the way I like to begin these overall negotiations is to just try to reach out so that we're not as confrontational as could be, because I know we've had the back and forth between this Article 22, and I think that a lot of our concerns may actually be in line. So I think it would be helpful
I would agree.
if we go over this. On my end, we're obviously looking to develop this mall. So what's important to us is finding an anchor store, an anchor tenant that's going to be, with us for a long time, that's going to draw in customers we'll have a good working relationship with, and draw in customers so it'll help make, not just the mall and the satellite tenants, but everybody involved profitable. But in addition to that, we'd like to avoid conflicts with other satellite tenants because they're also important and integral to what we do. And in terms of overall character, that's something that's really important to us. So maintaining the character not just of the mall, but also your store as well, and making sure that it all meshes well. And that's not something that necessarily has to be in conflict with anything that we have. And I think that it can work well for both of us. What's good for you is good for us. We want to see you get a lot of customers. We want to see you achieve high sales. We want you to have some necessary flexibility going forward, so that way you're staying on the cutting edge and you're doing well, because by you doing well, your sales are better, you're drawing more customers, and you help our overall mall. At the same time, we obviously don't want to become one gigantic store and shut out the rest of the mall.
Agreed.
So hopefully we can find some middle ground in this.
Right, so understanding that you do need an anchor store to help make the entire mall successful, we do understand the importance of satellite stores as well in terms of building upon sort of that baseline value that we would provide. And to your point, what's good for you, what's good for us, we want to certainly make sure that the microeconomy, if you will, of this mall can flourish.
Absolutely.
With that being said, understand your concerns in terms of wanting to make sure that you have a tenant who's committed for an extended period of time, who isn't going to sublet the crap out of the store. With you initially being under the impression and making the deal based on the idea that we would be that anchor. We don't want to have you thinking that we're just going to flee the scene after a couple of years. So that being said, to your point, there is some flexibility that we're going to seek simply because of economic factors can rise and fall, and that can take a toll on a business. So understanding that we are a larger business and we can afford some, I'd say, peaks and valleys, if you will, we do need to be realistic. So I think, to your point, there is a way for us to come out of this situation with benefits being realized on both sides. So would you like to just take this article sentence by sentence?
Absolutely. Seems the best way to tackle this sort of thing. So to be clear, we know the points of contention when it comes to this Article 22. The first one is in terms of use. What we're looking at here is what's going to be in the store, how it's going to be set up, and things of that nature. our big concern when it comes to this issue is avoiding conflict with other tenants.
Right.
Obviously. It's not necessarily good for you either if all of the tenants are being shut out and it becomes one store. If you wanted one store, you'd be able to build your own because you're a large chain.
Right.
We want to be in this mall together, so we can't flush out the little guys. At the same time, this is your profit. So I understand that, but going forward, we know kind of where you're at now. So we understand what your stores are typically like. I was wondering if you'd be able to just talk about some of the sort of changes that you want in terms of flexibility along the line, in the future.
Right.
Timing of these sort of things. What sort of changes are we talking about? A brand of jeans, simple change, or are we talking opening up a whole new, oil change service in the middle of the store?
Right. So we're not looking at that type of expansion or inclusion of products, if you will. What we are potentially looking to evolve in the near future from our business is, if I can find the exact quote here. Apologies for the delay. So we are looking to have growth in terms of providing compact discs, for example, with mostly classical music, at some point in time included within our stores, and a general electronics section. That it would not be as comprehensive as, say, a Best Buy, but it would still be considerable, and those plans are in our immediate future.
Okay.
So I apologize if having people find the exact quote of what we'll be covering. Right, so no final decision has been made on this, but we are looking to add, quote, high quality audio and video equipment and high quality, mostly classical compact discs to our store merchandise in all U.S. stores.
All right. So that's good to know, definitely on our end, because as you know, we've had some strong interest from some of the satellite tenants. Not saying, this is something that's set in stone, but just to get an idea of what's out there right now, from Electronics Boutique, Cambridge Soundworks, Brookstone, Barnes & Nobles, Tower Records. A lot of these things, obviously, right now are set up in that sort of electronics,
right,
CDs.
In that space.
So this is kind of where our contention is starting to come. Because we have the interest from these satellite tenants because they understand that, this is a possibility that Summit stores might be joining this particular development. If that's the case, all of these satellite tenants will be flushed out if this happens soon. So when you say you're interested in this sort of shift, do you have an idea of what time your company's hoping to go forward in this, or because just in general, our satellite tenants have a 10-year lease, which is different than the anchor tenant lease will
right, which is 30 years, which we agreed upon. So understanding that, I believe there are other tenants that are interested as well, correct? And beyond the electronics sort of
absolutely, it is limited after that. As of right now, we have Williams-Sonoma, CVS, Crate and Barrel, and the Nature Company. And when you think of those, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't you currently involved in small kitchen items as well? Kitchen accessories?
We are. So we're comparable to a Neiman Marcus. So we have some home items as well as, for example, clothing. That's more towards
Okay.
the higher end. So
All right, so that's interesting to know, though. In terms of the length of our lease at 30 years, then I guess something to consider in terms of this use, just to get an understanding, is this something you're looking to do next year? Is this something you're looking to do? Is this a long-term project, not till for 10 years or beyond, or is there some idea of this?
nothing has been approved. It could
It could or could not
fall.
happen.
It could fall through. It could be a direction that we choose not to go in. It's something that we're attempting to flush out because it provides a competitive advantage in that we're bringing more products to our store that would draw in essentially a new customer base. Or when people are already there shopping, they can, I guess, eliminate those needs for basic electronics right then and there.
All right.
So that being said, understanding that in most malls you do have overlap in terms of
Absolutely.
offerings. In terms of, I'd say there are a couple of factors that we can consider here. The first of which would be separation. So thinking about having smaller stores that we may compete with directly or indirectly further away in the mall from us. Understanding
Alright.
that if they were to be located next to us, then that could cause problems. But being the anchor store, people will filter out and shop elsewhere in the mall. We do want to have their own identity be preserved.
Absolutely. Okay. I understand that. We have, obviously, there's a limited space. We can only build, so much room for this anchor store.
Mhm.
I mean, it can get vast, but regardless, there's this space. So you set up, you build, you fill it with all of your products that you're selling right now.
Right.
When you do move into this other line, if you move into this other line, how will this affect the products that you're already selling? Are you intending to get out of other markets, or are you simply looking to maybe shrink down what you're currently selling in terms of, because you'll need space for the new inventory?
Right. Assumedly, we would have to pull back on some displays, or we would have to reconfigure the store in terms of displays to retain the same inventory, but still, again, make additional room for what would be coming in terms of the electronics.
All right, so maybe this is something where maybe this will be a decent segue into the subleasing discussion before we necessarily finish our use. It's difficult to picture having, I suppose I shouldn't get too far into this before I understand what you desire from the subleases, because if we have too many subleases along with getting into the other new department, what we originally got into this anchor, chose your anchor company for, would get phased down significantly in size. The idea of more subleases come in, newer products on your end, and things of that nature.
Mhm.
So, I guess I know I've harped on this issue a bunch in terms of overall time of this. Maybe it's because I'm having a hard time understanding how it would all work. Presumably it would take quite a few years before your company is able to fully expand into this market.
I would agree.
How long would your length of term for subleases be?
Length of term for
If you're going to invite potential other tenant into your specific store,
Mhm.
is this something that would be a permanent fit in
For
your
the-
store,
oh, you're
or would they
asking-
have a 10-year lease similar to our satellite tenants?
So that's up for debate. It certainly wouldn't be permanent for the remainder of our lease, for example. For the sake of our profitability, it would make sense when we sublet to have essentially 1 year, 2 year, short-term leases
Alright.
from other companies. So I'd say we would be remiss to think that agreeing to a long-term deal with another company who's subleasing, that they will remain, profitable and they won't endure any peaks or valleys, mostly valleys that we're concerned about, obviously, during the term of their tenure there. So keeping that on the shorter side to start, and again, given that we would, as the tenant, have the power over those subleases, right, with your considerations as well. But again, for the sake of our financial health, it makes the most sense for us to have shorter terms in terms of subleasing.
All right. So I suppose there are some benefits and drawbacks. I see both sides of that. I do like that, in that a potential benefit that comes with that is there could be a potential deal for us to work out here where it's going to take you some time to get into this new industry.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're interested in having some of these subleases, maybe this is something we could push towards the beginning of our lease. And when you intend to move into new product lines, some of these subleases, particularly the ones that are not, very successful, but they're just floating. You're
Right.
not losing money, but it's not making a booming profit.
Right.
There's something here, maybe those could be phased out once you move into your new product line. Because the worry on our end, as mentioned before, in terms of overall character, is that we'll lose, the overall strength of Summit if there's too many different new products along with the sublease and all at the same time. So maybe if the timing of this was split apart, this is something that could come. Similarly, as mentioned before, one of the drawbacks in terms of short-term subleases, which doesn't necessarily mean they're gone, is that you'll have high turnover.
Right.
And in this case, that's another thing that could be a detriment to the overall character of the store if it seems like it's a rotating cubicle of, as an analogy, one of those bad Chinese restaurants whose name changes every other year. So, just an idea. I was hoping to get your overall thoughts, I suppose, on, I guess more on subleases before we dig apart anything else.
So before use and assignment, even.
What sort of, how much space of these subleases will they be taking in your store? How many do you intend on having? Things of that nature.
So, I personally don't think it would be prudent for us to have too many sub-leases in our store.
That's good to hear.
But at the same time, we also want to retain control. I think that it would be a terrible business decision for us to have too many entities subleasing within our store, just because that becomes an issue of having to manage the tenants and keep track of their individual success. So obviously the benefit to that is helping to mitigate any loss that we might be experiencing or any sort of downturn that we're experiencing and putting that more on what could be new hip technology or new offerings and that sort of thing. So again, I think ideally we want to have as much control as possible over the lease, but we at the same time understand that we should be liable for anything that happens underneath that. So I would say that we'd be open to discussing some sort of ceiling in terms of the number of subleasers that are brought in. But I think, and this will come into the conversation a little later on, we also want the ability to have assignment, sort of a way for us to step aside if things go awry. And obviously, when that does happen, we will want to retain responsibility for at least a base level of rent until a tenant is filled. In that case, it's in our best interest, obviously, to be here for the long run and sort of embed ourselves within that culture. But I'd say we'd be more open to tighter subleasing and use restrictions to accommodate, as long as we have a financial out, if you will, if the economy starts to turn down. And I feel like we can come to some sort of agreement that benefits both of us in terms of you still receiving some sort of, baseline compensation until the store is filled, for example, or the space is filled.
That makes perfect sense on your end, and I hear you, and I think that's a reasonable thing for us to meet in the middle on. The tighter restrictions we have on subleasing restricts your overall ability to be flexible. Similar with use. So, just for us to understand going forward, the more restrictions we put on use and sublets, the easier it has to be for you to get out.
I would
Correct.
say that is the trade-off. So understanding that we won't necessarily jump ship, and I think that there are quantifiable benchmarks that we could put in place that would essentially trigger certain actions to come into play, or certain circumstances, I'd say, to be enacted. So that being said, I think that for all of these terms, the use, assignment, and lease, as we go through these sorts of restrictions, if you will, we'll want to have quantifiable benchmarks to set against that. So understanding, for example, if we wanted to sublet or sublease to a certain company that is in the same line of business as one of our satellite stores, is there a grace period that we allow for that satellite store from the time that they, for example, first move in to establish themselves before we sublet?
All right.
Or something along those lines that could help preserve the integrity of the satellite store's business. Understanding that, yes, the anchor store is very important to the mall, but the success of the satellite tenants, it's in our mutual interest, because the satellite store the anchor store may constitute 70% of visits, but that is a lot of revenue to leave on the table from users who may be driven to the mall from those satellite stores and then happen to come in and stop to see our products. So with that being said, we do value their business as well, and to the point that you made, if the satellite stores don't succeed, you don't really have a mall. You can't sustain it. So we want to take advantage of the appeal of the mall. Additionally, this region is very important to us in terms of market share. So understanding that, I think that we can definitely find a way to play fair on that front. So I noticed that in terms of the rebuttal that you provided to our standard terms for use, assignment, and subletting, one of the things that you wanted, your company wanted, is the right to approve or disapprove any movement in terms of subletting or assignment, for example, or use for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there can be sort of a standard, what's the word that I'm looking for? Sort of a standard that we can look to and say, okay, this is fair, we will go by this, and if this circumstance does come into play, or if this does occur, then legally we will have no choice but to defer to that standard. So it's not a matter of, if I want to sublet, I need your approval. It's more like, if I want to sublet and these specific terms aren't met, then it just doesn't happen. It can't happen. So
Do you have an idea of what some of those specific terms might be? Something on our end, that's not something easy to necessarily quantify all of those necessarily. Are you thinking of something in terms of, a percentage of sales decrease over the years, overall?
So I think assignment, that would be something
Market
that
share.
could come into play. I think for for use and sublet sort of fall into the same category of, if we wish to expand, how does that affect, or if we wish to change the offerings within our building, how does that affect business outside? So I think that one thing that we could put into play is, for example, to give Satellite Store a certain grace period, wherein if they've been in the mall for under X number of years, that we agree not to expand into that business either through subletting or through our own expansion. So that can help them to gain traction and ultimately to preserve some of their customer base, even if we were to begin offering, for example, electronics, if a Tower Records or EB is there. I'm making a joke because both of those companies are now defunct, but when the fuck was this written? Sorry. So if one of those stores, for example, was in the mall and they had been there for under 2 years, under 2 years, then we would agree to wait until they've been there for 2 years to begin offering products either through subletting or through our own expansion. So that, again, helps to preserve their right to their own territory, helps them gain traction, gain an audience, and then we sort of enter the market as the lesser player, if you will. So understanding that our business comes from offering so many different things, we do want to preserve, again, sort of the specialty of the satellite stores, and we think that that's an easy way to do so.
One thing that I do appreciate from your beginning discussion of where you wanted to expand in terms of your use is that you weren't talking about expanding into the overall CD market.
Mm-hmm.
You weren't talking about blowing up the electronics market. You were specifically looking at a set,
Classical
CDs,
yeah.
Specific electronics, and things of that nature. Or not necessarily specific electronics, but to a much smaller scale than something at Best Buy. You're not offering TVs and games and everything along that spectrum.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
It's high quality audio and video and classical compact discs. So for most people, that isn't exactly affordable. Again, we're like a Neiman Marcus in that we're high end, but again, the vast majority of consumers won't be purchasing within that sort of pricing bracket, if you will, because that's reserved for people who have much higher disposable income as opposed to somebody who might shop, for example, at a Circuit City. I'll just throw that out there because they're defunct too. Does that make sense? So,
Absolutely.
Understanding that when we would evaluate these grace periods, for example, we would want to look at the precise business and if it does target the same sort of user base, if you will, and we can set parameters in terms of the target age, income, what pricing looks like for their products, and if it falls within X number of dollars, for example, of pricing, then that would constitute the need for a grace period. But if the market that they're targeting is different, even if they are in the same line of business, then there's an argument to be made that you're not targeting the same people there. So.
All right, that is definitely an interesting thing to keep in mind. But overall, I like the idea where this is going in terms of, just as I mentioned, where we might begin to reach a compromise here, a discussion of a grace period for specific niches in the market.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of against the satellite tenants in terms of competition. Perhaps there's some sort of agreement going forward. I know you mentioned wanting to have total flexibility in the markets you expand in. However, is there some way we could reach this agreement now where we don't necessarily limit saying those are the only markets you can go into, but sort of along those lines where in the future you can expand your product base to specific niche markets and not necessarily all CDs and videos, but specific in future years of this lease, will you intend and planning to go towards the specific items that were mentioned?
Mhm.
So that way your overall plan is still intact.
Mhm.
And we at least have an understanding of where we're going forward in terms of what we can sell to our satellite tenants when we say, here we have this great anchor store that's going to draw in tons of business for your company.
Mhm.
If they're nervous about you expanding into these markets, at least they can understand going forward what exactly it is you intend on entering.
Right.
And if there's something in place where that, I don't want to necessarily say limits, but perhaps if it's anything beyond that, there's another discussion going forward or something along those lines, just to help protect from the idea of just a total
Right.
different product base.
Understandable. I appreciate you keeping this expansion that we're planning on sort of front and center here, because I do think now that we discuss it, the fact that it is high quality audio and video and only classical CDs, that it doesn't necessarily cut into the market that, again, a Tower Records or an FYE or something along those lines would be marketing against. I think that in terms of determining if the companies are in direct competition with us, or rather if we are in direct competition with the companies, it could help to have an arbiter, like a third party that we have come in and do a competitive analysis, for example. And through their expertise, they would decide if we were, in fact, in violation of terms, if we were allowing for a grace period, for example. So that, I think, can be the objective sort of baseline or benchmark that we can point to in any sorts of these situations.
I like the idea of third-party arbiter. I think that makes a lot of sense because that could be an easy point of contention in our partnership down the road that I don't want to get into, quite frankly. Because I could easily say that something is in competition, you say it isn't,
Exactly.
and we go head to head. So
Right.
having that arbiter definitely makes sense for both sides.
It's an investment that's well worth making, I think, for the
I
sake
agree.
of our relationship.
I think that could be something that even as of right now, we don't necessarily need to have in, spent. However, when you do intend on going for use, for increasing what you use the store for, that could be something that's triggered that we have to hire out an arbiter.
Right.
I like the idea of that. In terms of grace period, what length of time were you thinking?
I honestly think a fair length of time would be 2 years. So if you think about it, that's enough time for the mall to have its grand opening, sort of draw on that initial base, grow that base over the course of nearly 800 days, and then again have those satellite tenants have benefited from that length of time. So 2 years is what we would like to initially start with. We feel it's fairly generous, given that it would probably take us, a considerable length of time to even ramp up an agreement with somebody who's subleasing or ramp up our own product offerings to compete even with those satellite stores.
Absolutely. My one concern in terms of this grace period time is the length of time that these small satellite tenants, agree to in their lease,
Mhm.
being 10 years, and it isn't necessarily that they're all starting at day one for this 10 years, because after the 10 years, some may leave.
Mhm.
And if that were to happen, and they may start then, or if one of them for some reason goes out of business, or for any reason at all, we lose one of these tenants and they start at one specific time, it is possible that your product line initiates early on in their beginning, And the grace period of 2 years, while that allows them time to begin to increase competition, it would be tough for them because then they're faced with 8 years of direct competition with a behemoth. And their costs, quite frankly, won't allow them to compete. I mean, we both know that if you wanted to drive them out. However, we've already understand that in terms of direct competition, they'll have this grace period, which is good.
Right. Human beings are habitual, and when they come to resonate with a brand and they're used to making purchasing decisions through, one specific track, they tend to continue to do so unless they are jarred by something. And honestly, the margins that we can offer in certain businesses, like lines of business that the satellite stores might be in, probably aren't that much different from theirs. So you think of a behemoth being able to offer lower prices to consumers, but we don't believe that that's as much of a concern. So you bring up a good point in terms of the leases being 10 years long and being faced with 8 years of direct competition. That can be daunting for anybody who's about to sign on. So
that's the biggest concern, is not necessarily those who are already in place, but given that this agreement of ours is 30 years, after the first 10, several could leave, and it could be
Right.
tough to attract new ones.
So just to clarify, you are offering exclusivity in markets to each of the satellite stores, so you wouldn't have 2 satellite stores in direct competition with one another within the mall. Because that point would essentially fall in line with the point that you're making against us expanding into those markets. We're trying to create an environment where they're the one and only store for a certain specialized good that appeals to a certain audience.
Absolutely, that makes perfect sense. So I assume now is when we take it to the next step and say, well, Electronics Boutique, Tower Records, things of that nature, they're already close in competition.
Right. Well, EB is more of a video game store, so it makes sense that you could have. Just going off the cuff here, EB is more video game electronics than anything. Tower Records is more music than anything, and again, they tend to be very vast in terms of their offerings. I know you mentioned Crate and Barrel, which is home goods, essentially. You mentioned Brookstone, which is this hybrid of quirky electronics.
They're their own beast.
And home offerings. Yeah, exactly. So none of those companies you mentioned are in direct competition with one another. I think that if we're going to be held to the standard of not interfering with that target market that a certain satellite company is chasing or satellite store is chasing, we should hold those satellite stores to that same standard.
I think that is a reasonable expectation. I understand how you feel that way. I guess this kind of brings back to the same concern of the 2 little people fighting it out versus the bigger store with easier margins to play with. You can afford to take a hit on one item, whereas they take the hit on their special item, they're done. So they wouldn't necessarily be able to take the hit with each other. They'd be at similar prices. So while they're at competition, they wouldn't necessarily be eating their profits necessarily as much as if they were against you. But at the same time, I understand, because it's not good for us either. We don't want to have the 2 stores cannibalizing our profits.
Right.
Because we get rent on what they sell.
So just to clarify, we don't have a direct interest in them bickering with one another. What I would say concerns us most is, say for example, you have a consumer electronics store that competes in a certain market, right? They come in, they receive a grace period, and then we begin to build our business. So say in year 2 or year 3, we begin to offer similar products, right? Then another satellite store comes in and offers the same type of products. In theory, they should receive that grace period, but we can't give it to them if we've already started building our business and there's already another satellite store there. So understand, I'm just saying that in terms of offering a grace period, it would have to be offered once every 10 years, essentially, to the first store that is available to receive it. So
Can you expand on that? When you say the grace period is offered once every 10 years,
right.
so should this grace period occur now in the next 10 years, are you implying that there could be another grace period should that company go under and another come in?
Yes. So what I'm saying essentially.
So you would be willing to move your products out if you've
So
already expanded into that specific.
no, and that's a good point. That's a good point. If we've already begun to grow our business, then we can't accommodate that, which makes sense. So I would say that, however, if there's a company that comes in that offers a totally new product that hasn't been seen before in the store, they receive a grace period right in there because they're the first of their kind and we don't currently offer it.
So we're talking about a grace period for first of its kind stores. I think that makes sense.
Right.
I'm fine with that, and quite frankly, we don't want the satellite tenants cannibalizing each other and eating our profits either. That's not good for us.
Right.
It's similar. We don't want 3 stores now selling CDs in one mall. You get crazy.
Right.
But at the same time, we're having that. If should another store decide to come in, this grace period now, it's making it a little tougher. If you'd be willing to bump up that length of time for that grace period, I think that one time and not removing your product or anything like that, I think we could accommodate that if you'd be willing to bump up your length of time for your grace period.
All right, I'll tell you what, that's definitely something that we would consider, especially since this is a fairly long lease and there's a lot of opportunity for us to grow, even with those types of restrictions. So I would say, would you be willing to table that for
Absolutely.
the moment? I think that we're in alignment in terms of the benefits of a grace period, and you do make a good point in terms of 2 little guys coming in and duking it out as opposed to a little store competing against us. And again, we don't really have any dog in the fight in terms of those smaller satellite stores competing with one another. There will just be a grace period for first of its kind stores in the mall.
All right, I think that is a good starting point. In addition, just in terms of besides this whole grace period,
Mhm.
I know there's nothing that's been set in terms of when you want to build this whole new product line. But can we at least agree on a set time where Summit will say Summit, what it is for now, before we begin these changes, subject to these grace periods, even if I'm not necessarily talking about something that is, half the length of the lease necessarily, but some sort of time where Summit is able to build their brand in this specific location, because this region, it's huge that we get that started early.
Right.
So we don't necessarily want something necessarily being changed too quickly.
That's understandable. So let's see. So something that I do want to bring up just sort of as an aside or a compliment to what the conversation is at right now. Those stores, Williams-Sonoma, EB, Cambridge Soundworks, Brookstone, all of those tenants have submitted their interest knowing that we are the anchor tenant.
Absolutely.
So we would be doing them a great service by allowing for that grace period. And I didn't mean to step back from the point that you just made. I just wanted to catch that quickly before it escaped my mind. So the grace period is a service that we would be doing them for the sake of the mall, if you will, and for your sake in terms of retaining your tenants. So I think that can be sort of the icing on the cake for these stores. They've submitted their initial interest and understanding that they will get a certain period of time before we essentially agree to expand. So to the point that you just made, it would take time for us to ramp up get approval on and ramp up any sort of initiative along the lines of the high AV, or the high quality AV goods that we would offer, or the compact discs that we would offer. Given that it hasn't even gone through approval, once it gets approval, we need to send out RFPs to distribution partners, identify those products that we actually want to house. So that whole process could take anywhere between 1 to 2 years. So while I'm wary of putting a restriction on when we can bring that to market, ideally I think it would be good to have sort of a clear path of landing for us whenever that does come to fruition, understanding that we are, again, doing a favor to those satellite tenants and giving them that grace period, and understanding that it's going to take time to ramp up no matter what. So that's sort of baked in there already. And again, in terms of what we'd be looking to expand into, the high quality AV stuff and the compact discs, it doesn't directly compete with any of these companies because they either have a wider variety in the example, or in the instance of compact discs, or they serve an entirely different market because they have more household, I'd say, audio video goods that are, more economy size or priced at that economy level.
I think that's reasonable. I guess one of the concerns is, say the independent arbiter that we hire for any reason should say Tower Records is in direct competition with what you intend on supplying for products. With those very first 2 years of our lease agreement, that'll take you that long, quite frankly, just to get into the market, get what you need, and get ready to distribute to your stores to sell.
Right.
I'm afraid that this initial years is that part of this grace period that's built in for these satellite tenants.
So for these tenants that have submitted their initial interest, I'd say we would look for an exception in terms of that business that we would look to grow, the high quality AV and the classical compact discs, understanding that the business of a Tower Records, for example, which is the only full record store in here, is very different in terms of offering a wider variety. They attract a wider range of people. The CDs for us are more of a complimentary sale, given that the people who are shopping for high quality audio video equipment or are shopping in our store to begin with are likely hotty-toddy and make a lot of money and probably enjoy classical music because they're that type of person, if we're being honest. I know that we both probably make hundreds of thousands of dollars ourselves. I enjoy classical music and I would never go into Tower Records. So I think that is it's a very compartmentalized exception, meaning that it sort of lives in its own small corner of the universe and wouldn't have much impact on Tower Records. And again, given that we're willing to put this grace period in place for all other businesses, and given that these businesses have knowingly accepted or knowingly offered their interest.
And that comes the crux of one of the issues is these satellite tenants are interested for what Summit Stores is now. And they may not be interested in this 10-year lease because they're not aware of the new markets. I only learned the specific markets that you're interested in expanding to however many minutes ago we started this negotiation. So it is my fear that this is something that, while we may not agree, I mean we may not believe that they're in direct competition, they may see it differently once they find out, and by then it could be too late if they were only given 2 years at that point. I understand, this is the idea of the grace period that we're looking at. However, this is a brand new mall, and it's going to be more of a difficult idea, which is why I was somewhat hoping that the initial could at least give them half the length of the time of their lease, being 5 years, before your products hit the shelves. And then we don't have to worry about any grace periods for them because they are completely unaware of this potential
Right.
path. That's just something that I think could pose a problem to some of these specific stores, being in Soundworks and Tower Records and Barnes and Nobles.
Understandable. So, what if we were to defer to an arbiter and have them decide if our potential business would conflict with a Tower Records, for example, and were it to conflict, we would provide a grace period of 2 years for that specific line of business. For other lines of business, the grace period could potentially be longer. But understanding that this could become part of our strategy as a company,
Absolutely.
and that it would benefit both of our parties for us to grow in this manner ultimately. It's something that we want to try to preserve and keep on track. It hasn't been approved yet. It's going to be discussed in an upcoming meeting, a planning meeting that occurs tomorrow. So understanding that we do want to protect our interests for growth, but we do, again, empathize with the concerns of say, a Tower Records. So what we're proposing is on the front of the high quality audio video and the compact disc business, were it to be proposed, we could defer to a third party arbiter, right, to evaluate the connection between that and, say, a Tower Records. And if there was direct competition, then they would receive a 2-year grace period.
In addition to the length of time for you to ramp up your production, or
So during those 2 years, we would be cleared to ramp up production. It would just be 2 years, and then at the end of that second year, that's the exact day that we could bring to market those goods.
so they would have 2 years of time. So essentially, there's no grace period for you then, because you're using that time anyway to ramp up your production.
It's a grace period for them because essentially it's the public has no idea that we're ramping up these offerings. And in the meantime, they can't come to our store and buy it. It's not like they have any current investment in that, and they're not going to, hold out on buying something simply because we're going to have it in the future. They would rather go to, say, a Tower Records. So it would be 2 years, and that would be for whatever period we decide for future companies or the other companies, the first of their kind companies. It would be the first day after the end of that grace period that we could bring them to market. We could have, R&D and development and distribution all taken care of, in chronological order leading up to that. And then on that first day after the grace period is over, we could have those products in stores. That's ideally the situation. It's not that we can begin thinking about that because
Absolutely, no, that makes sense. We're certainly not going to be the mall that tries to stop Summit stores from planning their expansion. That's not what we're trying to get here. I guess a question then that I'm having is, if it's going to take you 2 years to reach this production, what is this grace period then? What's the difference? If there's 2 years before your products can hit the shelves because of the grace period, how is that different than the first 2 years until your products hit the shelf because it takes you that long to get going?
So the 2 years to get going is an estimate. So in theory, if we were to decide that this would become a critical and central part of our strategy, it may be expedited. It could be expedited to 6 months. And obviously, any additional time in market that we can have with this stuff on the shelves is better for us if we do decide it's central to our strategy. So if it's not in direct competition with a Tower Records or any other business, then we want to ensure that we'll be able to get on the shelves as soon as possible and that we won't have to endure a grace period if there's no need for one.
I think that's reasonable, because another concern of mine is I don't want your Summit stores to be different across the country, because that looks bad. You don't want to be the Summit stores in Northview, Massachusetts. That's totally different than the Summit stores across the country. That looks stupid. I don't necessarily want to agree immediately to the 2 years. it's definitely a consideration. I like the idea of that grace period. As mentioned before, we tabled the length of time
Mhm.
for the grace period for first of its kind. The length of grace period that we reach for those, I would like to be able to be similar for these beginning stores. We don't need to necessarily beat our heads against that now because we have other issues that we can discuss in the meantime,
Mhm.
which might help to reach an agreement on these.
Agreed.
So hopefully we can come to some sort of idea on that. However, for use, I think that hits most of our concerns, and if we can agree to those specific length of times for grace periods for first of its kind and for these beginning stores.
Mhm. Well, these beginning stores are first of their kind.
Yes, absolutely. I suppose the first of our kind, when we mentioned that, was more new stores down the line.
Right, but it would
If
hold
they
true
were
for
to
these
be-
as well.
Absolutely. So that specific grace period that affects them and those down the line.
Mhm.
And then the arbiter will be used for any of these competition analysis. I think that's reasonable. I think that'll reach most of our concerns for the use of the store in terms of what you're selling and the restrictions that come with that.
Right.
When you start expanding to these markets, one overarching thing, which ties into use, ties into our subleases, and ties into the assignment, is the idea of a buyback option. Essentially, should something go wrong in terms of use, assignment, or subleasing,
Mhm.
where we fully disagree with the results which may have come for one of them, or should you try to reach a point of assignment where you want a different operator to come in and we don't like this operator,
Right.
no matter how similar they might be to you. This buyback option, is that something you're open to? In terms of, if we don't agree with what happens here, we provide you with some sort of compensation
So
and it's ended.
I think that would primarily deal with assignment and subleasing. In terms of use, I don't think it's as
If we
pertinent
come
there.
up if we come up with these agreements, I think that's
Right.
perfectly reasonable that won't need to be something that's in place.
Because in terms of use, essentially, you decide which stores become satellite stores, right? We don't have a say in that. So ultimately, again, if our business has already been established in a certain area and a satellite store with that same sort of target comes in play, then there's nothing that you can do about it. It's solely up to you, right? But in terms of subleasing and assignment, if you disagree with our behavior, a buyback option seems like a good idea. In terms of disagreeing with our behavior, we would certainly want some insurance when it comes to the potential financial losses that we would incur by no longer being in the store. So we can discuss that. I was hoping we could hit on subleasing very quickly before.
Absolutely, I
that-
think it's a good time to touch on that.
Because I feel like subleasing and use
Go hand in hand.
they do go hand in hand. I think that the same guidelines could apply to subleasing in terms of if we bring in another company that competes directly with another satellite store, it shouldn't be allowed. I think that, or there should be a grace period. So after that grace period expires, either we can start the business ourselves or we have clearance to bring in somebody to sublease in that line of business. Does that make sense?
I think that's reasonable. I think the same agreements that we reach in terms of what products you go into, we can reach the same agreement in terms of what comes in for subleases.
Agreed.
I think it's reasonable because it's a similar issue in that we're having a difficulty in determining the effect that the competition will have, and I think that's a reasonable way to deal with it. For subleases, I guess there's a couple special issues, however, that arise with subleases versus your own products. One thing that's important, and I'm sure you feel very similar, is that it maintains the character of the store.
Right.
You don't want to have some random tenant in your store with a separate entrance and exit that just it makes it look like we have a separate satellite tenant in your store and it just looks.
All right. So, to recap our agreement, in terms of use, Summit will agree that for all of the satellite stores, right, that have their own sort of realm of business, we will allow a 2-year grace period for them to establish their business if they are in the high quality audio, video, and classical CD business specifically, as
Yes.
determined by an arbiter, right?
Yeah.
For all other stores, all other satellite stores, a 3-year grace period will be established will be granted if the arbiter determines that they are in direct competition with
a satellite store.
I probably didn't frame that correctly, but I'm so fucking tired right now. So, so that's for use.
For sublet.
For sublet, it's the same terms, essentially in terms of the grace period. So someone agrees not to bring any business into a store, essentially, by sublet or by its own means. For 2 years for high quality AV and classical CD business, right? And 3 years for all others.
Mm-hmm.
And this is only for first of its kind stores.
Mm-hmm.
So once a store of a certain kind has been there for 3 years, even if 6 years down the road another store of that kind comes in, we don't have to redact our line of business if we've brought something out along those lines.
Okay.
Sublet terms, if the developer challenges that 40% of the ground space, floor space in Summit stores is being used by sublet, everything above that needs to be approved by the board, right? The board will consist of 6 people from Summit, executives, 6 executives from the developer, and then 3 store owners, which will rotate every year.
From the satellite
From
tenants.
the satellite, yep. In terms of assignment, after 10 years, the Summit stores can file for assignment, and ultimately an arbiter and auditor will approve whether or not the potential assignee is suitable based on profitability, sales volume, and creditworthiness.
Mm-hmm.
Also, after 10 years, both sides reserve the right to buy their way out of the lease. So terminating the lease, but they essentially need to pay 5 years worth of rent to the other party. So 5 years worth of Summit's rent. So it's essentially Summit pays an additional 5 years of rent based on the average yearly rent up to that point.
Mm-hmm.
Or the developer pays 5 years worth of rent based on the average yearly rent up to that point back to Summit. And that's due within 2 years of termination.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, I think, additional detail for sublet. When space is sublet within Summit, the only representation that the company can have is the back wall logo for their company. And obviously the area inherently will have its own separation from other areas. So, beyond that?
Only extra information in terms of sublet that we agreed to is that the sublessee will not have representation.
Right. No personal
employees.
representation. So, for example, if space is leased out to Johnson Murphy,
It's still some employees working.
it's still Summit employees working there. There are no Johnson and Murphy employees present.
I like it.
No, this is a good agreement.
Shake
Got
on
it.
it.
Shall we shake? Beautiful. Wow. That was probably